Welcome to the Emerging Civil War podcast. I'm Chris Makowski, and joining me today is Dr. Jeffrey Boutwell. And Jeff's here to talk to us a little bit about the most influential politician of the 19th century that you've probably never heard of. So, Jeffrey, thanks for being with us.
That's a great segue, Chris, into my favorite topic, which is George S. Boutwell. Yes, he is a family member, a distant relation from New England farming families. But I really do like to call George the most significant American public figure that Americans have never heard of. I'm happy to go on about that at length. I'll give two quick responses, which is what I do in my book talks. One, George was involved in public affairs for 65 years, from 1839 to 1904, 1905, when he died. Continuously involved in all facets of American public affairs for 65 years. There aren't too many people that have that longevity. Even more important is the depth of his expertise. George Boutwell, over those 65 years, was equally proficient in domestic policy, civil rights, and constitutional law, in economics and finance, and in foreign policy. And we can get into his various career jobs that led to that proficiency, but very few people have gone from being, say, an expert in constitutional law to being an expert in economics and finance, or likewise in foreign affairs. And he was equally proficient in all three.
Now, he really makes his biggest stamp, I would argue probably during Reconstruction. But he gets his start as a legislator in Massachusetts. And you talk about how he really loved kind of like the rough and tumble business of legislating. And
Mhm.
that's really kind of how he cuts his teeth. Um, Tell us how that sort of trains him to get into public life on a larger scale.
Well, 1839, George runs for local office in Groton, Massachusetts, where he would live for 70 years. Then runs for the Mass legislature in the early 1840s, serves 7 terms in the Mass legislature at a time when, of course, American politics are imploding. He's a Democrat because he comes from a farming family in Massachusetts. The Whigs are the dominant party in Massachusetts, but they're beginning to lose power. And of course, the Democrats are beginning to split up over the national issue of slavery. So during that time, he knows John Quincy Adams. Of course, Adams is in Congress in Washington, but people like Charles Francis Adams and Henry Wilson and Nathaniel Banks, other future famous Civil War figures, George gets to know them all in the 1840s through, as you say, the rough and tumble of Massachusetts politics, which then leads to his becoming the youngest ever governor of Massachusetts in 1851. And again, that's all because of politics imploding in Massachusetts. The Whigs have been dominant, but they're losing their grip. The Free Soil Party has been created in the late 1840s by people like Henry Wilson, who want to stop the extension of slavery into the Western territories. George is still a Democrat, but the Democrats and Free Soilers come together in a coalition. They oust the majority Whigs, which allows George to kind of slip in as governor in 1851, and the rest is history.
He also has, as I recall, some dalliance with the temperance movement at this point, too.
That was very early on. His family were teetotalers. They didn't drink. George never drank throughout his lifetime, and he did initially join the Temperance Party in 1838-39. Remember, that's the era of progressive causes in America: temperance and religion, the religious revival, anti-slavery, all of those things. But George quickly realized he was going to get nowhere as a member of the Temperance Party, so became a Democrat.
Yeah, yeah. And I just kind of touch on this because, you bring up John Quincy Adams and this early temperance movement. And then, as we get to the end of our conversation and went to like McKinleyism and imperialism, and like that is an amazing stretch of US history to be deeply involved in. So yeah, I guess maybe underscoring the point you made earlier about, how significant his influence is over a vast
Yeah.
swath of our history.
If I can make 2 points, the absolute joy of writing this book, and it really kind of took me a long while to get convinced that George deserved a biography, but finally I did. The two joys of doing the book is, one, of course, I'm a family member, and to be able to write about a family member that no one has heard of, but who really, played a consequential role in American politics for 65 years was absolutely, it was just a wonderful experience. But then, as you say, because he uh, experienced American history and shaped American history from 1839 to 1905. Just think of all that happened in American history during those decades. Crucial anti-slavery in the 1850s, Civil War, Reconstruction, Gilded Age, anti-imperialism, all of that. And the historian in me, which has been my first love my entire life, just reveled in the chance of doing a biography about a figure who could, encapsulate that history for 65 years. And if I can give one little kind of self-aggrandizement shout out, one of the nicest comments I've ever gotten about the book was by Robert Putnam, the sociologist from Harvard University who wrote Bowling Alone and other books. I did a book talk with him at the American Ancestors in Boston back in March. And Bob said, I love this book because it has great peripheral vision.
Ah,
As you're reading about George, you're also learning about the broad sweep of American history over those 65 years. I just love that phrase, peripheral vision. Wasn't one that I came up with, but I'll gladly accept it.
yeah. And it's not like your family's been carrying the flame for George Boutwell this whole time. I mean, you said he was rather obscure even in your own family.
Oh, anything but. No one ever talked about him. I didn't learn about George from my family. We grew up in Winchester, Massachusetts, and then Concord, right near Boston, where George had lived. He had been youngest ever governor of Massachusetts and all of the other posts that he had. My family never, ever, ever mentioned George Boutwell, which when I learned about him later in life, I found truly amazing.
And as a historical biography, this is a bit of a departure for you in your own typical work. Tell us just a little bit about your own background, and then we'll kind of get back to George in a second. But tell us kind of where you have come from as a writer and historian, and then how that led to George.
Sure. Again, my first love was history in grade school, junior high school, even high school. But then in college and after college, I started to get more into public policy issues. Ended up in Berlin, Germany, because I wanted to learn German and go on to graduate school in German history and politics. But being in Berlin and then learning German, just kind of serendipitously, I found myself with an internship in the White House in the Carter administration in 1978, 79, and found myself working on nuclear weapons issues at the time because that was a big issue in European politics. So here I am with European political expertise, and they want me to work on all of the demonstrations that are going on in Europe against the deployment of new American nuclear missiles and whatnot. And that's kind of how I got into public policy. That then led to my going to MIT to get the PhD in political science. And yes, had a 30, 40-year career in public policy, but always was a historian at heart. So in my retirement, when I had the time, was able to return to that.
Uh, so let's get back to a story because I'm easily distracted, as you can tell. You've got a fascinating background, a fascinating story here. So George becomes governor of Massachusetts at a time when the Republican Party is rising. So he's in on the ground floor, and that's kind of how he gets to meet some of these movers and shakers on the national level.
Mhm.
How important is that for him to make these contacts?
Very, very much. Present at the creation. He helps create the state Republican Party in Worcester, Mass. in 1854-55. He gets to know people like Salmon Chase. He gets to know Lincoln. A very important, and it's a wonderful story in the book. There was a Thomas Jefferson birthday anniversary dinner at the Parker House Hotel in April of 1860. 59. George, as a former governor, is in the chair. He is, master of ceremonies. Well, that dinner has people like Carl Schurz and John Andrew and other important, political figures of the Republican Party. And there are letters received from the four major contenders for the presidential nomination the following year: Lincoln, Seward, Chase, not from Bates, but from the Blair family on behalf of Edward Bates. So George kind of is getting to know these national figures who are all jockeying for the Republican presidential nomination the following year, and indeed finds himself in Chicago in 1860 at the convention. He's asked to be one of 7 drafters of the Republican National Convention. There were, 450 delegates. He's asked to be one of 7 drafters, along with Horace Greeley, Carl Schurz, Gustav Kerner, and a few other people. And he's the one that helps write that famous plank about no extension of slavery into the Western territories, which, of course, the South is going to use as their excuse to secede once Lincoln is elected.
And you talk a lot in your book about how George really is kind of influential in shaping public thought for the Republican Party in a way that maybe Lincoln isn't or can't. In sort of Lincoln paces himself differently than the party does, but George has a big influence on how the party's thought develops in a public and private sort of way.
That was a wonderful revelation in doing the research. George is a senior member of the Republican Party, but he's not yet an elected official. So he goes to the convention. He then is appointed by Lincoln to be revenue commissioner in 1862. So he's part of the Lincoln administration, but more of a minor role. He's not in the full cabinet. But that allows him to say things that Lincoln yet cannot say. And of course, in 1862, Lincoln has to be very careful about losing Kentucky and Missouri and Maryland and whatnot, of losing moderate Republican support or even moderate Democratic support in the North. So for him, the war is still about union. It's not about slavery. For George, he has no constraints like that. He has been talking even before the Civil War at a famous Harvard Phi Beta Kappa lecture, and then especially in August of 1862, at the so-called Great War meeting on the steps of the U.S. Capitol, 10,000 people in attendance. Lincoln is sitting on the platform along with Bates and Chase. George Boutwell is the second speaker that day. He's the only one of 10 speakers who talks about, folks, there's only one reason the Civil War happened, slavery. There's only one way we can end the Civil War, emancipation. And he just says it clearly, gets a good response from the crowd. Even more importantly, gets a great response in the press in the days following, even in the English press, which is very laudatory. And so he's able to say things that Lincoln is not yet able to say. And in that sense, I think he's kind of a stalking horse for preparing public opinion for what Lincoln will then do on September 22nd and issue the Emancipation Proclamation.
And obviously, by August, Lincoln has already told his cabinet in July that, emancipation is on my mind. I want to make this happen. But he's not quite ready to make that jump because the public's not there yet. So George's public statements in August are really an important step in kind of priming the pump, it seems to me.
They definitely were. I have an article about that in the current issue of the Journal of the Abraham Lincoln Association. And it is, frankly, a little piece of new scholarship that the book has help bring to the light. And you're right, Lincoln, of course, was thinking about it. He was committed to doing it. It was just a matter of when. He had to wait for the kind of so-called Union victory at Antietam. Not much of a victory, more of a draw, but it was enough for him to release the proclamation.
Now you mentioned George was in the revenue service and so kind of a minor position, but I believe you have described him as like the father of the modern income tax.
Mhm. He,
So he does have some lasting claim to
he
fame in
was
that.
indeed. I should revoke that minor official because it was an incredibly important job. Imagine that George Boutwell arrives in Washington on July 17th, 1862, in the depths of a terrible summer for the Union. McClellan is retreating from the peninsula. There are Union wounded all over Washington. The so-called bottom is out of the tub in terms of revenues, but Congress just has passed a new revenue act to raise new funds, which includes, for the very first time, an income tax. On the 17th of July, George arrives at the Treasury Department in his little cramped office of Revenue Commissioner. He's got a total of 3 staff members. 8 months later, when he leaves to take a seat in Congress, there are thousands of revenue assessors and collectors all over the North raising needed tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars for the Union war effort. It was a Herculean effort. He worked 7 days a week, often well into the night, past midnight. And that was just kind of the guy he was. He was a striver. He just put his nose to the grindstone. Whatever he put his mind to, he wasn't going to finish until the job was completed.
And as I recall, he was a believer of the progressive tax and sort of like you tax people by what they could pay as opposed to sort of
Absolutely. Yeah.
flat
As
tax.
a farming, from a farming family in Massachusetts, he believed in labor and working man's issues. If there was going to be an income tax, it should be a progressive tax that taxed the wealthy more than middle income. And very much like today, there was a ceiling of about $600 at the time where you weren't taxed at all. That was kind of the poverty level at the time, and you only were assessed the tax beyond $600. So he helped introduce that progressive income tax. So when I tell people that I'm related to the person who introduced the income tax and not to hold it against me, that essentially, it was a fair tax that we still have today.
Yeah. Now, you'd mentioned that he eventually does go into the House of Representatives. What makes him decide to make that switch from the administration back to an elected office?
I think George was really a legislator at heart. He loved the cut and thrust of legislative politics, of crafting legislation. The 7 years he had in the Massachusetts House in the 1840s, he enjoyed that much more than being an administrator, say a governor or a revenue commissioner. So he runs for election. He's elected in his home district in Massachusetts, takes a seat in 1863, and for the next 6 years is one of the prominent radical Republicans, along with Thaddeus Stevens and George Julian and others who, go to toe with Andrew Johnson after Lincoln's assassination to essentially implement the 14th and 15th Amendments and protect Black rights in the South.
And to me, that was really interesting because that election is a time where Republicans actually have some setbacks because of the unpopularity of the war. So he's still getting elected as a
Mhm.
Republican against the tide, um, and it really also to me spoke to his public service mindedness too, which I thought
Mhm.
was pretty impressive.
Yeah.
So in the House, that's where he first has the opportunity to meet Ulysses S. Grant when Grant
Mhm.
comes east for his promotion in March of 1864.
Yeah.
Was George on board with that? Is he a Grant fan? Does he become a Grant fan?
He doesn't really know enough about Grant at the time. He certainly is in favor of Grant as the military commander because Lord knows the Union needed somebody. And so he's fully in favor of Grant taking command of Union troops. He had been, along with Stevens, dubious about whether the post of lieutenant general should be, kind of resurrected. But he quickly becomes a Grant fan. He gets to know Grant very well right after Lincoln's assassination when he is questioning Grant in congressional testimony in congressional hearings about what Andrew Johnson is doing to try and undermine congressional reconstruction. So by the time Grant is elected in 1868, the two of them have gotten to know each other quite well, which of course that then leads into Grant asking George to become Secretary of the Treasury.
So and your book really talks about this really lifelong friendship that they end up developing. So they go from kind of like political allies to being really dear friends.
Yeah. Um, from 18 March of 1864, when Grant, has that famous White House reception and gets his commission as Lieutenant General that George was at until 1885, when Grant is buried in New York City, and George is one of the pallbearers for the Grant funeral that goes 7 miles through New York streets in August of 1885 up to Riverside Park. In those 21 intervening years, the two of them had really gotten to know each other beyond just their political alliance. And I think they recognized many similar qualities in each other, kind of both self-educated, or even, I mean, George wasn't even as well educated as Grant. George never went to high school, never went to college, never got a law degree or anything. He was totally self-educated, much like Lincoln in that respect. But they were both extremely modest, hardworking individuals. They were not out for self-aggrandizement. They were not looking to promote themselves constantly, like many other figures at the time who were much better well known. Of course, Thaddeus Stevens, Ben Butler, Charles Sumner, larger than life characters, which is why we know them today, which is why George kind of flew under the radar. But he and Grant recognized a lot of the same qualities, love of family, and the friendship extended really to the Grant and Boutwell families beyond the two of them.
Yeah, and I want to point out that, one of the kind of the neat bits of original research that shows up in your book is you found papers in George's correspondence that kind of outline this even after Grant's death that sort of talk about
Mhm.
that family relationship.
Yeah. I was very, very fortunate in the sense that one, no one had ever really done a major biography of George before. But secondly, that all of his papers were, kept and preserved in his house up in Groton, Massachusetts, which was taken over by the Groton Historical Society in 1933 when George's daughter died and willed it to the society. Just imagine those things are sitting up in bankers' boxes for decades, decades and decades. They're not protected. They're not in climate control. They're not digitized. They're not even really, fully annotated and indexed. Just sitting there in bankers' boxes. A few people had gone through them before, but I'm the first one really who went through them systematically. And thank God they were there because it really allowed me to flesh out his story.
Wow, wow. So you've alluded to his relationship with Andrew Johnson, or the tumultuous relationship with Andrew Johnson. Let's get into that a little bit because George is laying the case out early
Hmm.
against Johnson, and when Johnson assumes the presidency and immediately sort of takes a hard turn from Lincoln's path, and George is right there almost at the very beginning, kind of calling out what he sees are abuses of power and failures of character. Um,
Um,
Tell us about that.
yeah, yes, George was there a good deal earlier than even other radical Republicans. The story really begins in late May of 1865. Lincoln's been assassinated in April. It's only 4 or 6 weeks after the assassination. The country is still kind of reeling and not really knowing what to make of Andrew Johnson and what's going on. Johnson issues his North Carolina plan, his Reconstruction Plan for North Carolina at the end of May in 1865, which essentially will reconstitute the Southern white government. All that will be needed is signing on to the 13th Amendment. And George is very, very suspicious of this. He says, no, no, more is going to be required of North Carolina and other southern states to come back into the Union. George is in Groton at the time. He comes down to Washington, wants to meet immediately with Johnson. Johnson says, look, this is just a test case. Let's see how it goes, and then we can decide later. And George, as he admits later, wrongly agrees to that and says, "Okay, I'll give you a few weeks to see how it goes, or a month or two." And he quickly has second thoughts about that because, of course, Johnson starts putting in, Southern governors, white governors, and administrators throughout the South, and undermining congressional Reconstruction because, of course, Congress is in recess and won't be coming back into office until December. So Johnson has this wonderful 6, 7 month window which he can do pretty much whatever he wants in the South. And George very quickly recognizes that what he's going to do is just rehabilitate Southern white governments, bring them back into the national government with essentially no penalty having been paid for treason and having left the Union. So by fall of 1865, George is now conferring with Thaddeus Stevens and others about what's going to be needed. Come into 1866, and the radical Republicans are going, toe to toe with Johnson. And really, the first major salvo in the impeachment process appeared in October of 1866. George writes an article for the Atlantic magazine called The Usurpation. And essentially, he lays out his bill of particulars as to why Andrew Johnson is aggrandizing power in the presidency, undercutting Congress, refusing to spend appropriated monies from Congress. He's undercutting the Freedmen's Bureau and all other aspects of congressional reconstruction, which to George merits impeachment. And that August or October of 1866 article is the first real set piece in what will turn out to be the impeachment trial in May of 1868.
Now, I actually came across that piece as I was researching for our conversation today. And first of all, like a really well laid out argument, but boy, I
Mhm.
couldn't help but think there were resonances from his piece, and just talking about how politicians can, you know, they can be susceptible to all these different character flaws that then can impact how they lay out their policy. And
Mhm.
so it seemed to me that George was really questioning everything about Johnson, not just policy issues, but like as a person, he's not living up to this responsibility.
Right. Yeah. He's just kind of demeaning the office of the president, but especially in his unilateral policies. He is, and I don't want to draw the conclusion, parallel too much with today, but he is undermining Congress. He is undermining the checks and balances in our American political system. And that's exactly what Andrew Johnson was doing and why George Boutwell thought he should be impeached.
And George makes, I think, a really subtle but important argument once formal impeachment proceedings get underway. Um, Tell us a little bit about how his view of impeachment is different from his colleagues, who seem
Mhm.
to be kind of struggling with how to proceed.
That was a fun issue to tease out in the book. At the time, most of the men on the impeachment committee, Butler and Bingham from Ohio and others, thought that impeachment should rest on an indictable offense. It should rest on a violation of law. And so that's why there was so much attention paid to the Tenure of Office Act, which had been passed actually precisely to entrap Johnson into firing Edwin Stanton and then violating the law that Congress had passed about, president not being able to remove a cabinet officer until he had conferred with the Senate. George didn't feel that way at all. He said, no, it does not have to rest on indictable offenses. High crimes and misdemeanors can consist of abuse of power in office, even if no law has been broken. And if his counsel had been better followed, I think Johnson might have had a better chance of being convicted because the Tenure of Office Act really was a kind of a convoluted, artificial way to impeach a president that many senators just didn't buy into. As someone famously said, there were, 11 impeachment articles lodged against Andrew Johnson. 10 of them were all about the Tenure of Office Act, just defining it in different ways. There was one impeachment article written up in 10 different ways. It was the 11th article that George had said was the crucial one: abuse of office, abuse of power, undercutting Congress, not following congressional, enacted legislation and things like that. Well, today, his view is much more widely shared by constitutional scholars. Impeachment can rest on abuse of power and aggrandizement of presidential power, and not just violations of the law.
And of course, the Tenure of Office Act gets declared unconstitutional anyway. So it's
Anyway,
really a straw
anyway,
man. Yeah.
exactly. I mean, when Johnson said you're accusing me of violating an unconstitutional law, he was absolutely correct. Tenure of Office Act was unconstitutional from the day it was, enacted, except it hadn't been ruled so yet by the Supreme Court.
Now, aside from his involvement with the impeachment process, well, first let me ask you, like, how does after the impeachment doesn't, finally get Johnson doesn't get convicted? Are there any repercussions on George as a result of that? Any political revenge, anything like that, or does he kind of weather that okay?
No, because the Johnson trial came so late in his presidency, that was in May. The election is coming up in November. Johnson at that point is a lame duck candidate. George Boutwell, he never writes this specifically, but I think he would agree that even though it came up one vote short of him, convicting Johnson, he would say it was still a success because it constrained Johnson. It made him damaged goods for the remainder of his presidency. Of course, the Democrats at that point wanted nothing to do with him, and so they nominated, who is it? Seymour from New
Seymour,
York
yeah.
to run against Grant, who loses badly. So George didn't suffer any political repercussions, and he thought that it even was worth doing, even though they lost, because it really kind of put down a historical marker as to what Johnson had done.
Now, the other real significant involvement George has during this period is with the 14th Amendment.
Mhm.
I would say a key milestone in his career. And he has a particular interest in was it Article 3 of
Mhm.
that amendment? Tell us a little bit about how he's involved with helping to formulate this idea of the 14th Amendment and then kind of shepherding it through.
Yeah. One of George's great qualities and great strengths was as a committee man. He could sit with a committee and draft legislation and work with others and put down on paper what, various people wanted to see expressed. He had done that in 1854 at the Massachusetts Constitutional Convention, an important kind of marker in Massachusetts history. He did that at the 1860 National Convention as a member of the drafting committee for the resolutions committee, and he does it again as a member of the Joint Committee on Reconstruction in 1865, 66, 67 with the 14th and then the 15th Amendment. working with John Bingham, Thaddeus Stevens, and others to put down on paper what they wanted to see as ironclad protections for equality under the law and Black rights in the South. Well, George begins in 1865-66 on a kind of a double track, both with the Civil Rights Bill of 1866, which says much the same as the 14th Amendment, but also the 14th Amendment. He's quickly convinced that, legislation can be overturned and negated in the future, but a constitutional amendment is much harder to overturn if it's passed. So he throws his energy into the 14th Amendment. Of course, John Bingham is the primary author of the first section, equality under the law. George Boutwell wanted to make sure that Confederates were not allowed back into the national government without serious obligations and penalties, that they had rebelled. I mean, Stevens felt the same way. They would look at their colleagues and say, what is going on here? These people took up arms against the Union government. They precipitated a civil war that led to 700,000 deaths that ravaged the country. And now you just want to give them the chance to reconstitute Southern white governments and come back into the government. And not only that, but of course, with the 3/5 provision no longer in effect, they'll have even more representation in Congress and the Electoral College than they had before, and they can recapture the national government, which is a real fear of his, that Andy Johnson would use the electoral votes of the Southern states, plus maybe with New York, a kind of a Democratic stronghold, to win the presidency in 1868. So he says, no way. Southern whites are going to have to, adhere their allegiance to a new union and to a new set of relations between the federal government and the state governments if we're going to allow them back into Congress.
And, this becomes, I've got to think over the last 12 or 15 months, as so many aspects of the 14th Amendment have come back into current events, that
Mhm.
as you had been working on this book, and tell me your thoughts about kind of seeing these very issues that you've been researching and writing about coming back into the political forefront.
It certainly is deja vu all over again. Birthright citizenship. That was instituted, of course, to undo the Dred Scott decision to make sure that blacks who were born in this country had citizenship rights, no matter whether they were enslaved, formerly enslaved, or whatnot. There were only a few categories of people who were not eligible for birthright citizenship, and that was the whole, rationale behind that. For George's case, there was also the disqualifications of Confederates who had taken an oath to uphold the Constitution and then broken that oath. And again, he thought that those should be there should be severe penalties and obligations incurred in order to come back into the Union. Well, insurrectionists taking up arms against the United States and interfering with the duties of Congress came up with January 6th in 2020. There are good pros and cons as to whether the language of the 14th Amendment on the disqualification of those who take up arms against the United States should apply to the insurrectionists of January of 2020. I won't get into that because it really is kind of a splitting of hair legal argument. But nonetheless, the general principle applies. These people violently tried to interrupt the lawful duties of Congress, and they should pay a penalty for it.
Mhm. Yeah. And Andy Johnson didn't support the 14th Amendment at all. He thinks the whole thing's a bad idea. And so he really works to actively try to undermine and oppose its passage. Um, does that create additional hard feelings with Congress that informs the impeachment process?
Oh, absolutely. No, Johnson is telling all the southern white states, forget about, ratifying the 14th Amendment. But he explicitly tells them not to at a time when it was really touch and go as to whether they would be able to get the votes needed to ratify the 14th Amendment. So Andy Johnson is trying to undermine Congress at every turn. He's taking money away from the Freedmen's Bureau. He's vetoing civil rights legislation, which only because the radical Republicans had a super-proof majority were they able to overturn those vetoes. Oh, George Boutwell hated Andy Johnson with a passion. Now, George, didn't get exercised much, but boy, when he got the bit between his teeth, watch out. And he, of all the men and people in American politics that he ever came up against, Andrew Johnson was his absolute bête noire. And I
So
think for good reason.
yeah, for good reason, indeed. So Grant gets elected president, and it looks like smoother sailing ahead, and it presents another opportunity for change of career for George, because he gets brought into the Grant administration. Why is it that Grant taps him to go into the Treasury?
This was kind of another nice little piece of the book because when I was researching it, I would read these accounts of, well, George Boutwell was just this kind of striving Republican. All he wanted to do was climb up the ladder, and he was, telling Grant, appoint me, appoint me. Nothing could be further from the truth. George wanted to stay in the U.S. House in 1868-69. The story is, of course, that Grant appointed a guy named Alexander Stewart, a wealthy New York department store owner, to be his Secretary of the Treasury. Charles Sumner comes up and says, well, that's not a good idea because, conflict of interest. We don't want a wealthy businessman running the Treasury Department. So Grant had to get rid of Stewart. And at the very last minute, Grant had already been inaugurated at this point. At the very last minute, he turns to George and says, George, I really need your help. You've got great political credentials in Congress as a radical Republican. You've got the economic and finance experience from revenue commissioner and governor of Massachusetts. You fit a lot of the bills for why you'd be a great Secretary of the Treasury. Would you please take this on? Well, consider that you're George Boutwell. 1868-69, he lives in Groton, Massachusetts. He's a farmer. He's got a wonderful 300-acre farm back home that he tends, still doing a bit of law work because, of course, at the time in Congress, you only had to be in Washington several months a year. You could go home and tend to your other business. All of a sudden, Grant is asking him to be in Washington 12 months a year, day in, day out, running a huge, the largest, department in the federal government. And there's a wonderful letter from George to his wife saying, you won't have heard the news, and I know you're going to be sorely disappointed, but I couldn't say no. I couldn't say no to my good friend Ulysses Grant, who really needs me in the administration. It means being in Washington day in and day out, but I had to say yes. So it wasn't as if he was looking for the job. Grant came looking for him.
Yeah, how do you say no to the guy who just saved the country? I mean, that's kind of a tough
Exactly.
no,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So how does he do as Treasury Secretary?
Um, by all accounts, and especially kind of 20th century economic historians who look at that period, they're very, very complimentary. George was kind of a conservative economic, conservative financial guy. Uh, his main task was damping down inflation, which had been rampant, of course, in the Civil War and after, taking a lot of the greenbacks out of circulation that had been printed to help pay for the war during the Civil War, and most especially establishing our credit worthiness with our European trading partners. He's got to get gold and paper currency back in balance. But he's got to do it slowly so that, on the one hand, farmers and laborers won't be hit by excess greenbacks being taken out because they need it to help pay their debts. On the other hand, the bankers in the East want, gold to be coming back into favor. So it was a delicate balancing act for 4 years that really helped put the American economy back on track.
And if people have downsides about the Grant administration, they usually talk about being scandal plagued and lots of controversies. But George really managed to kind of avoid most of those landmines.
He and Hamilton Fish, as the Secretary of State for Grant, were by far the two best cabinet appointees and did great jobs running both the State Department, of course, Fish in the Alabama claims issue, which was a wonderful success for the Grant administration, and then George in the Treasury Department. Yes, Grant erred in having a lot of his Civil War colleagues in other positions, Alfred Pleasanton and people like that. And when George, unearthed them, he would go to Grant and say, you got to get rid of this guy. He's not doing you any good. But of course, Grant was very trusting and a bit naive in that respect. So there was scandal, the whiskey ring scandal, Credit Mobilier, although that's not really Grant's fault. Credit Mobilier was under Andrew Johnson before Grant came into office. But there were scandals, but they never touched George.
And then he gets another act. That's one of the things I found incredible about George is like he gets act after act after
Act.
act. And so now he gets the chance to go to the US Senate after four
Mhm.
years in the Grant administration. Why does he choose that? I mean, he could probably rest on his laurels at this point if he wanted
Oh,
to.
he could. Nope. Again, he was a legislator at heart. He wanted to be in the U.S. Congress. After 4 years, he went to Grant and said, I really want to get back into Congress. And Grant grudgingly said, okay. He serves 4 years in the Mass Senate. And of course, those are four incredibly important years because it's the end of Reconstruction. The radical Republicans are losing power in Congress. Uh, Radical Republicans like Carl Schurz and Horace Greeley have given up on Reconstruction. They want nothing to do with it any longer. And George, by 1875, 76, 77, is one of the last remaining voices in the Republican Party calling for protection of Black rights in the South. And that's evidenced most in his famous 1876 Mississippi report, where he documented white supremacist violence against Blacks and white Republicans during the 1875 Mississippi elections. But he, just wouldn't give up. He wanted to go back, and only way he did give up was he was defeated for re-election in 1876 back in Massachusetts, because even the good folks in Massachusetts were getting tired of Reconstruction. And they said, George, enough is enough. We want to look ahead. 1876 is the country's centennial. It's a big birthday party for America. The business of America is business. Let's put Black rights and Reconstruction behind us and, move into the future.
But you make a really compelling argument in your book that he becomes this really important voice for black enfranchisement, the idea of black people being able to have ownership of their own destinies and really empowering them to be able to help themselves. And to me, that was like a really triumphal sort of part of kind of this thing he discovers about himself that kind
Mhm.
of comes into its fullest being during this period.
Yeah. The example I love to give of that is George was a big believer in Black agency. If we give Black Americans the tools by which to become full citizens, i.e., public education, the vote, legal rights to serve on juries and whatnot, if we give them the full panoply of civil and political rights, they will become full productive citizens of the United States. He believed that beginning in the 1850s all the way through to the end of his career. So he's a big proponent of Black agency. Well, that was brought home to me more than anything else by a 1933 master's thesis that I found from the University of Wisconsin by the eminent Black historian Benjamin Qualls. Qualls, taught at Morgan State for many years, and Qualls wrote about the Black experience all through American history, Revolutionary War, Civil War, Lincoln, and whatnot. Benjamin Qualls was one of the earliest proponents of Black agency, even before John Hope Franklin and people like that. Well, in 1933, and such a great story, you were in the midst of lost cause historiography. The Southern narrative is dominating the American historical profession. It's dominating American culture with Birth of a Nation and all of that. Benjamin Qualls, as a young Black graduate student, arrives at University of Wisconsin. He wants to write about a Black figure that he really admires. He wants to do his master's thesis on Frederick Douglass and the concept of Black agency. He's told by a particular white thesis advisor, no, we won't let you write about Blacks. One, there's too little primary information. We're not sure that Blacks writing about Blacks can be objective. How condescending can you get? He's told in no uncertain terms, no, you can't write about a Black figure. So he looks around for somebody else from the Reconstruction period and he finds George Boutwell. He writes a 120-page master's thesis on George Boutwell called George Boutwell, a Radical with Reasons, showing how Boutwell was a champion of Black agency back during Reconstruction. And he's doing this in 1933 at a time when the Southern white narrative is dominant in American history. Well, to me, that just kind of said it all as to, how George really did stay the course and how this is someone who really, really deserved to be better known to the American public.
Wow, what a discovery. And so he has the chance to ride off into the sunset after his defeat for the Senate, except he doesn't. So now we've got like
Doesn't.
this final act that we get to where the McKinley administration and we've got sort of an involvement in lots of different places around the globe for the first time, conflicts popping up here and there, Cuba, the Philippines. And George really feels the need to lend his voice to what's going on in the world. Tell us a little bit
Mhm.
about that.
George didn't he didn't know the meaning of ride off into the sunset. He didn't know the meaning of retirement. Even in the 1880s and 90s, he's no longer serving in public office, but he's a regular columnist for the Boston Globe. He's doing things. He was hired by the Kingdom of Hawaii in the 1880s
Oh,
to represent its interests before the U.S. Congress. He even represented the Mormon Church in term when it came up to the anti-polygamy bill that was introduced in Congress because he believed in the separation of church and state. Didn't believe in polygamy, but he said, U.S. government is going after the Mormon church. We need separation of church and state. So George is still active in a lot of issues in the 1880s and 90s. But then when it comes to the Spanish-American War, 1898, McKinley is making clear that America is going to militarily occupy the Philippines once we've beaten the decrepit Spanish Armada in Manila Bay. And George, comes together with people like Andrew Carnegie, Mark Twain, Jane Addams, W.B. Du Bois, and others in the so-called Anti-Imperialist League to call to oppose America's annexation of the Philippines, American military adventurism overseas, which he saw as very similar to what the British Empire was doing in South Africa and India and whatnot, the Boer War. And he said, we do not need these entangling alliances or entangling um, responsibilities overseas. They're only going to lead to the deaths of American soldiers. We can get everything we want with the Philippines through trade and diplomacy. We don't have to militarily occupy them. And that's not a very popular narrative at the time. America is striding into the 20th century. This is going to be the dawn of the American century. And especially when McKinley is assassinated and TR comes into power. Well, of course, TR epitomizes that more than anybody else. His Great White Fleet that he sends around the world in 1907. It's the dawn of American imperialism, and it's very much a losing proposition for George and Carnegie and Twain, but they continue to, oppose it and speak out against it and mobilize public opinion against it right up until George dies in 1905.
And to me, that's just a really neat capstone of conscience, which to me that sort of became the through thread of the book to me,
Mhm.
was just this notion of, all this stuff that he does and all these things he gets involved with is really driven from this sense of personal values and personal conscience.
Yeah. Principle over party. George believed fully in the principles of American constitutionalism and not in political parties per se, which is why he left the Democrats in the 1850s to become a Republican. And at the end of his life in 1900 and 1902, when a Republican president, Teddy Roosevelt, is annexing the Philippines, he totally opposes it, tells everyone he's listening to, don't necessarily vote for the Democrats because they are the party of white supremacy, but be careful who you do vote for. Look at them carefully and recognize that what America is doing in the Philippines, at least in his mind, is trampling on the constitutional or the self-determination rights of the Filipinos, much the way we did to blacks in the 1850s and before the Civil War. He drew a strict comparison between those two and was very much, you know, adhere to principle over party.
Uh, So, as folks pick up your book and they spend some time with your ancestor, what are some of the things that you hope people walk away with?
Have to put in the disclaimer very quickly. He's not my ancestor.
Oh,
I've learned one thing in this book from genealogists: you don't call someone an ancestor unless you're an absolute direct descendant
so
of
he's
that
he's
person.
he's collateral, right?
He's
Collateral
a
member.
distant family member,
Yes.
distant cousin.
Okay.
Uh, it is that, the selfless um, attention to detail, attention to fundamental principles of American Republican government, constitutionalism, no matter which party is in power or which party is doing what. George never veered from that. And we need more of that today.
Yeah. And I'm sure that there are people who might listen to this interview or look at the book and be like, well, it's his family member. Of course he liked him. But like you had to grow to like this guy through your work as well. It wasn't just an automatic.
That's very true. As I said, one, the family never mentioned him, so it wasn't as if I was trying to glorify a family member. And even when I did learn about him in my 30s and 40s, I'll be totally honest, his two-volume memoirs 60 Years in Public Affairs, written at the end of his life. I found the writing kind of turgid, self-aggrandizing, not very complimentary of many of his contemporaries. He was a curmudgeonly old guy at that point.
Right.
On the other hand, there were enough nuggets in there about what he had done in his life that was obviously, it was worth investigating more. And I guess that what really was lucky, Chris, was that in the last 20 years, George has really, the raps have started to come off from other historians, people like Eric Foner or biographers of Ulysses Grant. Let me mention Charles Calhoun's The Presidency of Ulysses Grant, especially. New treatments of that period, even Brenda Wineapple's book on impeaching Johnson, all of them giving much more credence to, the positive role that George Boutwell played during that time. So I'm getting reinforcement from other historians as I'm beginning to look into him more, which only made it the more worthwhile.
Fantastic. So, last question here. What's up next for you now that you have set your family member aside?
Oh, I haven't set him aside at all.
Okay.
I like to. I describe George as the gift that keeps on giving. For someone who was in 65 years of public life, equally proficient in constitutional law and race relations, economics and finance, foreign affairs, I'm writing articles in all of those areas that have something to do with George today. And it's great fun. I can really continue to do that for quite a while, giving a lot of book talks, Civil War groups, Lincoln groups, Grant groups, whatnot. And if I can just mention very quickly, one of the most exciting of all of them, on September 17th, I'm going to be speaking at the U.S. Treasury Building,
Oh,
in the
wow.
cash room of the Treasury Building where George worked, giving an in-house lecture to the Treasury Historical Association, but it also will be live streamed. But to be able to give a lecture in the Treasury Building right next to the White House, where George worked twice, both as Revenue Commissioner in the 1860s, as Treasury Secretary in the 1870s, is going to be a real thrill.
Wow. Wicked cool. Well, I wish you the best of luck. Yeah.
Great. This has been
So,
wonderful.
thank you
Uh,
so much today, Jeffrey. I really appreciate it. The book is called Boutwell. I urge you to go pick it up. Fascinating read about a fascinating character. Well written book. Thank you so much, Jeffrey.
Absolutely. Good. Thanks, Chris. Enjoyed it.
I'm Chris Bukowski for the Emerging Civil War podcast. We'll see you online and on the battlefield.